Thanks so much, everybody, for joining us for the second webinar in our series Navigating Chaos, Communication Strategies for Uncertain Times. This webinar on resilient communication strategies is brought to you once again by Buoy 231 Consulting, Mighty Bytes, and Access Living. Um, so we'd like to hear where you're from, joining us from, and anything else that's relevant to the conversation. Feel free to put it in chat, but we are going to get rolling now. So, my name is Nicole Hunter. I'm a project manager at Mighty Bytes, and I'll be serving as the host for today's webinar. Our goal is to give responsible communications team a primer in grounding your communication strategies for navigating the sea of uncertainty and technological change that has made it so difficult for us to keep up with what is happening, let alone respond accordingly. In our first session, we talked about grounding our communications in a foundation of storytelling. Today, we'll have a discussion all about building resiliency into your communication strategies so that your message can stand up to the turbulence of our current communications landscape. And here to help us find our footing today, we have our esteemed panelists. So I'll just hand it off to Tim to start.
Sure. My name's Tim, and I'm the founder and president of Mighty Bytes. We're a digital agency and certified B Corp located in Chicago. We've been around since 1998, and we help organizations basically improve their online communications. Digital first company. Go ahead, Bridget.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bridget Heyman. My pronouns are she and her, and I am the Director of Communications at a service and advocacy center for people with disabilities, run and led by people with disabilities, called Access Living in Chicago. It's my pleasure to join you today, and Jen, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Thanks, Bridget. Hi, I'm Jen Caddick. I'm the founder of Buoy 231 Consulting, and I'm a communications consultant that works with nonprofits to help them build communications campaigns that build awareness, change policy, and drive organizational growth. Excited to be here.
Awesome. Thanks so much. So now we'll take care of some housekeeping. So our conversation today should take about 45 to 50 minutes, depending on how it goes. We'll reserve about 10 minutes at the end of the session for questions and answers. And you can go ahead and submit any question that you might have using Zoom's Q&A feature, or you can drop it into the chat, and I'll do my best to keep up with it, and we'll call them out when relevant or again at the end. Finally, we'll have some resources that we'll reference today. I'll put them in the chat, but we'll also follow this webinar up with an email, and all of the links will be available there as well. So we can move on to the next slide. Today, we're tackling three primary topics. We're talking about resilient communications, then we're talking about content strategy and responsible governance. And on to the next slide. So last time we discussed how strong storytelling drives successful communication strategies. Jen and Tim, do you want to give us a quick recap on what we discussed?
Yeah, I'll kick it off. Jill gave us an amazing sort of crash course in the foundational elements of storytelling. We talked a lot about how you can dovetail your organization's goals and stories that you need to get out with what your audience is interested in. And so she gave a lot of great details on how to talk about the details and emotions that make a story impactful, the need to include a clear call to action. So once your audience has all those feels, they know what to do next. And I think Nicole is going to share the recap again in the chat, but there's a link in there to where Jill shares her sort of super easy Foursquare framework for building an effective story. Tim, what else do we cover?
Sure. Yeah, we also shared a content brief template to kind of help you manage the metadata around your storytelling. If you care about SEO, we suggested that you consider grounding your stories in what Google calls EEAT, which is personal experience that highlights your subject matter expertise in an authoritative and trustworthy way. We shared the brief template, and we also, Nicole wrote a great post on sustainable SEO, which we discussed as well. So with that in mind, I think that's a great way to get started with this series and talking how to apply storytelling and kind of digital strategy to communications, which is why we're here today. So I want to briefly touch first on the kind of environment that most communications teams are currently operating in. Build Better Change recently put out an unworkable work report, and they found that employees at all levels were feeling overwhelmed and frustrated by the volume and implementation of change. This is affecting organizations in the form of low morale, quality of work, lack of trust, attrition, and so on, as you can see in this graph here. For communications teams who face kind of a seemingly never-ending cycle of change, this presents significant challenges. And we had a conversation leading up to this thing about what are resilient communications, and is resiliency even the right word? And so I'll let Nicole take it from there, and then we'll have a nice little discussion about what that actually means.
Thanks, Tim. So during our planning session, as Tim mentioned, we were discussing whether resilience is the right word really to describe the session and what we're talking about here, or if there's might be a better or a more useful descriptor for what we're really trying to get at. Bridget, would you like to start us off on this topic?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think I brought this up in the prep session. We're hearing a lot about resiliency across all verticals right now, not just communications, every aspect of business. And I think I commented like, I am so tired of that word. Tired of having to be resilient. And that is certainly something that we feel a lot in the disability community too, because resiliency is something that comes up so often, especially when you're living in a world that isn't designed for you. And I am a wheelchair user, so I know about that firsthand. But I get what we're saying here when we're talking about resilient communications. We need communications that rise to the top no matter what the environment happens to be. And I think that's probably why you are all here today. We've got a diverse group of people in the room from a diverse number of areas in Chicago and beyond. And we're all trying to figure out how those communications rise to the top. I think, the sooner we stop thinking about us being in like crisis mode, because that's what we're hearing a lot, and we start thinking that this is new operating practice, the better off we will be. Because certainly the way you react in a crisis mode is not something that is going to serve you long term. And so, defining effective communications, being nimble with your communications, regardless of the environment, to achieve, your goals, I think is really what folks are looking for. And certainly what I think about every day as the communications director at Access Living.
Thanks, Bridget. Jen, do you want
Yeah.
to follow that up?
Yeah, I think that's really well said, Bridget. And to build off of that, we keep hearing and we have seen and all have experienced that chaos is the goal, right, of this current administration to throw us off balance. We keep hearing about their whole flood the zone strategy. And that's the point, is to drown out our messages that our organizations want to have out in the world, and the policies that changes we want to see. And so, this is a moment, to Bridget's point, is to, we can't continually operate in crisis. It's just not feasible. We're all going to burn out. People are already burnt out. But nonprofits, whether or not you're an advocacy group, really need their communications to be agile, to react when you have to react. Like, there are things that we're going to have to react to in the moment, but stay focused on telling the stories and building the future that we want to see and our stakeholders want to see. And I think there is real power in that. I acknowledge that is hard. It is not easy. It's tough. But I think that's where we kind of, what this is all getting at. And Tim, I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that.
Yeah. I mean, I think, Jen, when you and I were talking about what was originally going to be a single webinar on comm strategy and turned into a now 6-session webinar or, series, this is exactly what we were talking about. We were talking about, not having the practices and the foundational elements in place, which is why we started with storytelling last time, because we really wanted to make sure that everybody has the kind of foundational elements in place, because then when you're hit with chaos, it becomes less problematic and less, as Bridget said, you're putting you in crisis mode. So really a lot of this, and we're going to talk about this today, is about good governance and having really good governance practices that are grounded in resilience, and they can, help you better prepare and adapt to kind of the ongoing change, but also monitor and prioritize your actions so that there's continuous learning and improvement going on. And I think that's, not being in crisis mode, but being in learning mode all the time. And I think to me, there's a big distinction there. But that being said, to Bridget's point, if organizations aren't also balancing that resilience with like clear strategies to improve collaboration and build trust and those kinds of things, then they're undermining their own stability. So we have to, we have a full webinar dedicated specifically to organizational agility, innovation, and inclusion coming up in April, specifically on that topic. And it's going to definitely harken back to some of the things that we're talking about today. And unfortunately, the chaos that we're seeing, today, especially in online communications, isn't going away anytime soon, which I think is a great segue into our next topic.
Absolutely. So, with that in mind, how can we create communications that address the deluge of misinformation and disinformation hitting us daily while keeping our long-term strategic goals front and center? What can we do to meet these challenges? Um, I'll open it up for whoever wants to go first.
Well, maybe I'll start. This is Bridget speaking. We can't refute everything. There's just too much, and I think that you know, the instinct is to try and refute, but that puts us on our back foot as opposed to being much more proactive in entering the conversation. So instead of refuting something that's wrong, I think talking about something that is right, or correct or truthful is that much more important. And it comes down to relationship building to me. Being a trusted source for your stakeholders, and that they know when they hear from you, when they hear from your organization, what they're hearing is going to be legit. People get their information and their news in an echo chamber today. And so, really thinking about how that works, how you can become a trusted source and maybe build better relationships with the stakeholders that you want to get to know or the stakeholders that you already have. I think that that is really key because so oftentimes, as this quote very rightly points out, we spend so much time trying to correct, something that's not true. We're not doing a good job getting the message out about what is true. And so I think there's a third rail here in simply shifting the conversation to what we know it needs to be.
Mhm.
Point.
Yeah, and I think by repeating the negative, right? By repeating those falsehoods, we're just continuing to tell their story. We're not telling our story. And so you're keeping that, you're sort of magnifying those falsehoods, that misinformation. And to be clear, there are moments where you absolutely need to set the record straight. But I think being very clear about what your story is, telling that story, finding where your stakeholders are, where your audiences are, and going to them. It might not always be in the places where you are already, but finding out where they are, going to them, having those real conversations is super important. Finding those influencers in those groups, and influencers, I don't necessarily mean social media influencers, it could be those, but who are the people who have their own audiences, right? And they can be informal, right? It could be, I always think about one of my neighbors here who is sort of our informal neighborhood watch guy, right? He knows everything that's going on, but he's somebody that you want to be in touch with to get out information. And so, who are those informal people who can help you amplify your story and your information?
Yeah, it's a really, really great point. And to that end, our next webinar is going to be on coalition and community building. So that's a good segue, Jen. Um,
Well, and one thing I'd add just to build on what Jen was saying, I mean, you always have the opportunity to for education. So
Mm,
instead of being so married to the story that you have always told and elevating that, thinking about the opportunity to teach your audience something new that
mhm,
they likely don't know to help them connect the dots can really build trust. And especially if you back that up with good storytelling and examples of real life people who are impacted by this. I think, so much of what's happening now is confusing to people because they don't understand governmental structure or
mm,
the impact of an executive order, or maybe even how an executive order actually works and how that might impact their day to day. So, I would say 99% of the US population is not monitoring that closely unless they have a reason to.
Right.
And so, knowing that most of our audience isn't as deeply steeped in the work as we might be as communicators is a really important point, I think. And
mhm.
as communicators, we have to take a step back, take a deep breath, and think about what people might not know that we take as a given.
Right.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's a really, really good point. I think also this, for me, this underscores the importance of kind of research and analysis. And I oftentimes, we see in our clients that that's kind of tends to get the short end of the stick a little bit. And so, if you're able as a comms leader to help your team build skills and capacity around things like data analysis and stakeholder research and stuff like that, you're going to be much more successful in the things that both Jen and Bridget were just saying. So on that note, I think we have some content related to that.
True. So the first step to communication success is to understand who you're communicating with. So the big question here is how should organizations collaborate with those important stakeholders and audiences to co-create effective comm strategies? Tim, do you want to start us off on this one?
Sure. I think, everything that I've seen in communications, oftentimes, there and marketers are we're terribly guilty of this. Is honing down and focusing in on like a target primary customer profile or user persona or something like that. And that oftentimes puts the blinders on in terms of actually understanding all of the people and all of the kind of stakeholders who are impacted by the decisions that you make from a communications perspective. And so sometimes those are important. Understanding who the people you're talking to is absolutely critical, but they might not be the only people who are impacted by the choices you make. And so understanding that you might not have control over who your stakeholders are necessarily, and just having those discussions about like, what are the bigger ramifications? What does our kind of organizational ecosystem look like? And when we put a message out into that ecosystem, what are the potential ramifications, the unintended consequences, et cetera? And that's where we found that bringing stakeholders into that co-creation process in some way, again, through user research or through collaborative workshops or whatever, tends to be really, really meaningful and helpful to getting clarity of message, but then also understanding who is going to be impacted by that message. And the co-creation process ends up being very powerful. I don't know if Jen or Bridget, you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I would just plus one what you said there, Tim, and give like a real life example from Access Living. As a service and advocacy organization for people with disabilities, we are staffed with a majority of people with disabilities, and the majority of our board are people with disabilities too. And I can't tell you what a wonderful value that is as a communicator. I have a disability myself, but there is absolutely no way I could be representative through my lived experience of an entire diverse community that brings with it a number of experiences and perspectives. And so bringing as many impacted people as possible into the co-creation process for communications, like just a huge plus one, because it's really, you know, influenced our thinking, not only in how we communicate about certain things, but also thinking through the stakeholders that we didn't even realize we had, right? Or that we want to reach, and exactly what that messaging could be, because that's where your untapped market is. So oftentimes we are just as communicators in general and thinking about my career overall, you're so focused on the stakeholders that you absolutely do know. You're not thinking about the broader field. And no matter what brand we're promoting, we always want to think about that broader field and the things that we haven't tried before, and maybe the new opportunities. And I think times of upheaval are particularly good times to do that.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Jen, you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I'll just add on real quick. This is as I was thinking about this the other day, and now this conversation is resurfacing it. A couple years ago, my friend and colleague Crystal Davis wrote a report called "Shut Up and Listen." We had a big debate about whether or not to use that title, and we're like, nope, that's exactly what we're saying here, right? And it was all about community engagement strategies, but that's what the fundamental is right? As organization leaders or communications leaders, and to our point earlier about mis and disinformation, we make assumptions about our audience. We make assumptions about what they know, who they are, and instead, so often we need to just shut the heck up and listen. Don't walk into a room with assumptions and presumptions about what people are thinking and what they want, but really go to them, find where they are. Sometimes that means physically leaving your downtown office building and going out into the community, and really listening, and not walking into a room with a lot of assumptions.
Awesome. So the other question that we have here is what role should research play in this work of finding who your stakeholder groups are?
Anybody you want to call on?
Tim?
Yeah.
I know you have a lot to say on this one.
I have some thoughts. No, I mean, I mentioned it earlier, and I think the one thing that I also see on a regular basis is that research is typically done upfront and then shelved. And I think that if we're truly trying to be nimble or agile or insert the word of choice here, that needs to be iterative. There needs to be feedback loops in it that are ongoing, and so that co-creation process can't just happen up front and then you go away and go about your own little communications business, but you're really trying to figure out ways to continue to co-create, continue to analyze, continue to learn throughout that process, and then adjust accordingly based on what you learn. And so we're huge fans of research. It's critical to success. It gives us a chance to validate or refute any assumptions that we might have. It increases chances for all kinds of good things, especially, as I said, if we're including other stakeholders in the creation process. So I'm a fan, and I think it's a really important element of it. And it doesn't necessarily, if you have good data analysis and capacity and kind of skills building built in, then you can also reduce costs, reduce the amount of time, and reduce the amount of resources it takes to do this stuff. And so I definitely encourage communications teams to start building those skills into their teams if they're not there already. Anybody want to counter that? Feel free.
No, I think to add on to that, it doesn't, when we talk about research, I think a lot of times, especially communications professionals, think about big polls or
Right.
formal, focus groups, which if you have that funding, that's amazing. And, to have that kind of deep, in-depth analysis. But again, I think so much of this comes back to really quality listening. And, all of the tactics that Tim talked about, different ways you could collect some research, it just comes down to really solid listening, and making sure that you also have an awareness of who is in the room and talking and who is not in the room and talking, and to ensure that you've got a fully inclusive group of people you're listening to.
Well, and I will say that research is so beneficial, not only to ensure that your communications are on point and actually doing what you intend them to do versus just keeping you really seriously busy every day. But it is a good way to educate leadership on your effectiveness and also to inform your strategy. I mean, I think especially in these times, everybody has a different idea of what communications actually is and what it's supposed to do, especially on the senior leadership team. That feels like they're under pressure right now, like in a pressure cooker from board members, from the public, and spending a lot of time meeting with legal teams, right? How do we say this? How do we do that? And there is a trickle down effect to the communications team. Even if, like me, I am on the senior leadership team, and so I do have a say in kind of how that trickle down happens and what exactly happens. But research is my friend in actually working with my leadership colleagues to make informed decisions and to right size what our communications is and what it can do, because we can't be everything to everyone. And so this is, a solid way to pivot when you need to, and to show impact, or even to show how, that one thing that the development director says that you always have to do in peer-to-peer fundraising, you can show that maybe, yes, that works, or no, it really doesn't. And so we shouldn't be spending our time on it.
We also have a stakeholder mapping guide that I think Nicole will share in the chat, that we use to run certain exercises. And so I think thanks for the conversation on this, and hopefully you can find that resource useful.
All right. So we're on to content strategy now. So even the best laid content strategy plans can go off the rails when the unexpected happens. Given that we now live in a world of the unexpected, how should comms teams prioritize accessibility, sustainability, data privacy, inclusion, and all these other issues with so little time, resources, and etc. at their disposal? Are there any meaningful trade-off strategies that teams should be considering? I'll open
Go
this up
ahead,
to Bridget.
Bridget.
All right. Well, boy, that's a big, big question,
Huge.
Nicole. And I think we should take it in little chunks or pieces here. The first thing that comes to mind is something that Tim has referenced already, is a foundational approach, and not being afraid to actually take that breath, take a step back, and say, what is it that we really need to be focusing our time on here, in the most immediate sense, but then long term, that doesn't get us away from our true north, our goals, like that sort of thing. So, we're all under pressure. We all feel like we have a million things to do each day. And I was in a course recently about time management that we did for our entire staff. And one of the things that the expert said was, when you're feeling overwhelmed by tasks, it doesn't mean that you need more time to do them. You need more time to plan. And so that is the chance to take that step back. Now, I'm not saying that you take too long. I mean, we work in a world, right, where there's a 24-hour news cycle, and sometimes you have a matter of minutes. But as long as you mentally do that, I think that can be really valuable in determining the content that you're putting out quickly and over the long term. One of the things that we're trying at Access Living is actually it's a guide to responding specifically to current events, things that are happening right in that moment. And we often get pressure internally from our own teams like, wow, Access Living should be saying something about this. This really impacts people with disabilities. We also get pressure from our community of people with disabilities and members of the general public that look to Access Living for guidance on this because of our disability expertise, whatever it might be. And so we are trying to like host a very quick meeting with all of the really important decision makers in the organization and going through a discussion guide. Does this align with our priorities? Are people waiting to hear from us on this? What is the risk benefit analysis? And we take 20 minutes to have that discussion and come out of that meeting with a plan of action. What is our communication strategy about this particular thing going to be? And it typically happens before the end of the day. So, just taking that step back doesn't mean that you're slowing down. You're still doing rapid response. You may not be the first out of the gate, but I'm not sure in these changing times if that's always essential. Sometimes it is, but not always. And so I think that's something important to keep in mind. One other thing I'd say is we're seriously evaluating, because there's so much coming at us right now, what is part of like just our traditional content strategy that needs to stay versus what needs to go. And so that is looking at the data that Jennifer and Tim have referenced and saying, okay, yes, we've always had, a certain kind of week that we've celebrated, like whatever it is. And did we get anything out of that? Is that something that we really need to continue to do? And so it gives you the opportunity to look at your overall strategy there too and make some changes for efficiency, because we can't do everything. And I feel like we're doing so much more. So I'll leave it there.
Yep, Bridget, I want to pull out, that was great. And I want to pull out one piece. I am a huge fan of processes and checklists, right? Um, because they do a couple of things for you. Is when you're in that moment of overwhelm and busy and like everybody is staring at you to go get something done, right? Whether it's putting out a media statement or building a blog post, having a checklist that like just walks you through a process, whether that's the amazing decision tree you talked about as far as whether or not Access Living should respond to a particular issue, or even things like building a blog page or building your email that goes on your mass email system. Having a checklist, because in that moment of like, oh my God, I got to get this out and I got to get this done, you're reducing your decision fatigue, right? You don't have to have that like, oh, what was the thing that broke last time? And I got to remember. You've got that in a checklist. But also building in there some small things that help show your values and deal with some of those big topics that Nicole listed off, accessibility, sustainability, data privacy. Because I think in those small moments, that is where an organization really can consistently show your values. And so as an example, right, I'll be honest, when I build a blog in WordPress, I can never remember what the details are as far as making a photo so that it's accessible via a screen reader. Like, do I put it in the caption, the alt text? I don't know, right? Because you don't want your photo to come up as being like conference photo 54, right? You want to have some description for a screen reader. And so when you're super busy, you're having to like remember and think about like, oh, what was that thing? You're going to skip it, right? But then you end up with a website, if you skip it enough, that has a whole bunch of stuff that is not accessible. And so having those checklists, you don't want them to be 50 pages long, but they help you make sure that you are fulfilling some of those small values alignment moments that over time can add up, so that when somebody does come to your website, it's accessible, or you're paying attention to your environmental impact, or you're deliberate with the language you're using. It can include all kinds of things. So I just love that example you gave, Bridget, and I'm a huge fan of processes, because they can help chip away at some of these really big topics for a team.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
thank you, Jen, for using accessibility example, because like that is so incredibly important. Just to plus one that just a little bit too, in during downtime, thinking about developing good habits on your team and like having checklists for them too. So if there was a time where you weren't putting alt text on a picture, is that something that you need to go back and do? Having those projects ready to go when you've got time to do them can be equally important, and make those urgency checklists a little bit shorter, because the habit is already developed and it's just something that you already do as a brand practice. And so we're not perfect at doing that, I'll be the first to admit, but try to make the most of that downtime too.
Yeah, I love that. I think y'all are going to appreciate the next slide, because it is a worksheet, but specifically to do that, that also includes accessibility, data privacy, et cetera. When we work with our clients, what you measure reveals what you value, as I think you said that earlier. And we work with our clients to define success criteria and then figure out what your kind of measurement components are. What are your KPIs that you're doing? It's like, what does success look like? How do you measure that? But the sad thing that's happened on the internet in the last 20 years is that you can pretty much measure everything. And so figuring out, what is important to measure, and not falling into the trap of measuring all of it, because that's where people get pinwheelized and they just get completely overwhelmed. And so, staying focused on those metrics that matter, and most importantly, the people behind the metrics, and just understanding that there are people behind the data points all the time. Also, don't break the law. There are, like, in the case of accessibility, there are potential lawsuits that could happen. That's increasingly happening with data privacy. In Europe, there's now sustainability laws around the similar kind of thing. So, paying attention to what the legal ramifications are could also help to drive some of this work. And I'm not saying that's the only driver, but it is something that as you keep in mind as you're thinking about your content strategy. So with that in mind, Nicole, if you would mind sharing the link to our content strategy checklist here. We've had this on our website for a while. It's a worksheet to kind of help people understand or create a content strategy. We've recently updated it to kind of include some of these concepts as part of this webinar and stuff. It's an 8-step worksheet. You can do it alone. We love workshopping as much as we can. So, I think there's also opportunity to workshop it with other content strategy stakeholders, or co-create it with your organizational stakeholders, as we mentioned earlier. It includes guidance on accessibility, sustainability, data privacy, and a few other things. And it also includes a lot of links to additional tools and templates and resources. So hopefully y'all will find that useful, and would love to get feedback on it if you use it and find that it's missing something. So
All
on to our
right.
next topic, one of my favorites.
We're on to governance, one of Tim's favorites and one of mine as well. And thank you to the panelists, because we are right on time. So, in our experience at Mighty Bytes, good governance over time is one of the biggest challenges that our clients face. Unexpected circumstances tend to derail good governance practices. It's a huge topic and not one that we have too much time to get into too deeply. However, there are a couple of questions that might be relevant to today's topic. One, how can you encourage a growth mindset and a spirit of abundance with your team while still embracing good governance while everything is so chaotic right now?
Who wants to go first? Go ahead, Bridget.
Nicole, all these really big questions.
You
We
can
don't
pick
shy
two.
away
When
here.
you throw it out there, I'm like, oh wow. Okay. So I think it's always about providing opportunity on the team to cross train. And so that's what I have been doing lately, is all right, we need backup on all of these things, and everyone on this team has a different skill to offer. And so why doesn't everybody else go and learn that skill? That is serving us well, because it helps to eliminate burnout, because people can actually take vacation and they know that they're going to have backup on the team. And it also educates our entire communications team on what the governance actually is. So, especially if we're talking about websites and digital communication, I mean, certainly the day you launch that website, it's perfect as far as what you want it to say. It's got all the accessibility features and the look and feel that you want. But every time you add something new, if folks on the team don't know what the governance is, or they're not communicating with the rest of the organization what the governance is, that's going to slowly degrade over time, as Tim was talking about. And so I find that cross training and actually educating my team on why we do what we do, and to share that with all of our friends throughout the organization, makes governance everybody's responsibility, and not just, the head communicator, so me at Access Living, or the leadership team. So it becomes then everybody's responsibility, and you've got lots of eyes and ears on it, to actually keep things going in the direction that you want them to go. So let's start there. And that's just a tiny little piece of Nicole's
Right.
question.
Yeah, I think that's a great suggestion, Bridget. This question also makes me think about like how your team is communicating internally and how you are allowing space for experimentation. As the communications landscape shifts so dramatically, both politically and technologically, I've worked with teams where we had our weekly meeting. We looked at our key metrics we were putting out. We would look at that quarterly, we'd look at it annually, but then we'd use those meetings to say, okay, what kind of worked? What do we want to experiment with? What do we want to try? And then, it's hard to foster an environment where you can try something, and if it flops, it's okay. Trying those little pieces here and there, and having a conversation and building the trust in your team to say, like, hey, let's experiment like with a different style of email or a different style of social media post to see if it reaches a new audience, if it resonates better. And then look and see what some of your data says. Now, and keep trying those experiments. So if something flops, it could have just been you sent that email on a day where everybody was consumed with something else, right? And so trying to build that trust in your team. And I know we're going to talk about this in some of our later webinars as well, but like finding those little opportunities to experiment and talk about it can be really helpful.
Yeah, Jen, you bring up a really great point about the kind of cover your ass mentality that happens in many, many, many organizations due to fear of failure. And so like really, making sure that you can foster a place where failure is understood and embraced. So because it's all, no matter what, if you're talking about a growth mindset, failure is a learning opportunity, always. And so just understanding how that learning, kind of drives the decisions that you make moving forward, and helping everybody else understand that as well.
Well, and also just why do we have governance in the first place? And making sure everyone is on board with that and totally understands the hows and whys of it, because it's easy to forget that maybe not everyone understands the reason why. But also in having those discussions, it leads to better governance, because it also uncovers holes of new things that we haven't thought of, especially as we enter into like the probably generation of AI. Like that's not something that should be ignored. That's something that should be immediately used. So let's train on that. Let's think about governance for it. Let's think about ethics. And what are the smart questions we need to ask to get to where we need to be?
Bridget, it's almost as if you read our minds because our next question is on exactly that. So I'll let Nicole go ahead and let us share that with us.
Yeah. So, changing technology can undermine governance if organizations don't have resources to upskill or cross-change or invest in stakeholder well-being. So, how do you invest in emerging technologies like AI, for example, while staying the course on good governance? Another big one.
Yeah. No small questions here.
Yeah. No.
Jen, do
Yeah.
you want to start us off on this?
Yeah, oh, go ahead, Bridget.
No, go ahead. I wasn't sure who you said. I'm sorry.
Oh, good.
Um, yeah, so I think this is about staying nimble, right? Like this is going to change and it's going to change again and it's going to change again. Um, and the not putting your eggs all in one basket, right? Organizations that have solely built up a huge social media following on one platform are going to struggle when, that's going great for them, but inevitably that algorithm will change, right? Something will change on that platform. And so thinking about what data and information you and your organization control, I'm seeing a lot of groups start to really reinvest in their email strategies because you own that data, right? If something goes different with your mass email provider and you don't like what they're doing, you can take that and go to somebody else. You can't do that with your Facebook data or TikTok or whatever. And so being really clear about what you own and what you control and building on that, I think is a really important piece of the puzzle. Bridget,
About that.
you have thoughts?
Yeah, I was gonna say too, I think encouraging experimentation in all aspects of our lives. So I know every single one of the people that works at Access Living has a whole life outside of their work life. And often the communicators do their own thing through, adaptive sports or whatever as it is. Really testing some of the things you want to try in your personal life can be a low stake way of saying, hey, let's actually try this for a brand. We used to do that on the internet all of the time, remember, back when it was just blogs before social media. You would test a lot of these things with your personal brand before you would ever take it to a client or to your workplace. When I think about what's going on with AI and the shift in technology, and we all think, okay, where do we want to be in this landscape? I think it's a really good time for curiosity to think, what can I personally do with this? What can I test? That then it's less high stakes when you do that at work and when you do that for a brand. So somewhere along the line, I think we've forgotten how much fun that can be. And I think we need to remember. And that can be a little hard to do in the times that we're in. But these tools are really cool. They're amazing accessibility tools that could be used for good or for ill. And so we need to understand that. And we need to know how to use them.
Yeah, you bring up a really good point, Bridget, and that, generative AI especially is a kind of a double-edged sword because it's really great for some things like accessibility, as you noted, but it also can drive some challenges around privacy, copyright, sustainability issues, ethics principles, et cetera. A recent Amazon report, research report, just noted that 57%, excuse me, of all published online content is now either generated by or translated by an AI algorithm. And then in turn, search engines and chatbot algorithms consume and then regurgitate this content, further kind of devolving it from kind of like a snake eating its own tail. So, having the creativity to experiment while also trying to keep some guardrails on to have the policies and practices in place that make sure that stakeholders within your organization aren't accidentally uploading huge amounts of like private customer data or something like that. Like just having those kind of policies in place and also understanding that they're going to need to change because this stuff is changing really quickly, and so the policies and practices that go along with them are going to need to change as well.
Well, and we know that's already happening, right? We just maybe not have not uncovered it yet.
Right.
And so if I mean, I think your stats are fascinating, Tim. And if we know so much of online content is going to be um, filtered through AI in some way, what other kinds of communications do we need to
Right.
be doing face to face? Because it's all about relationship building in the end. And, how do we continue to do that on a personal level for brands? Maybe
Absolutely.
we've relied on social media too much for a little too long here, and it's a return to very basic face-to-face type communication to get to the truth of a matter, right? And so
Absolutely.
we're thinking about that too. What do we need to be doing in person? What needs to be like a community in-person meeting versus a webinar, that kind of thing, because I think that's going to become more and more important over time.
Yeah, absolutely. I
If
think
I
that's a
could,
great, go
oh
ahead.
no, I was just going to build on Bridget's point. This is your point, Bridget, is making me think about, there's a ton of conversation happening for organizations and their funding streams, right? Especially those
Yes.
groups that were so reliant for various reasons on federal grants, and the need for a wide range of funding sources, and thinking about that in terms of our communications, right? Not relying on one or two strategies, but having that diversity of communication strategies up and running, all in robust ways. That in-person, social media, email, website, that's going to become even more important, is having that really strong mix. And it can be hard for small teams, right, to manage all of those, but thinking about how you can repurpose your content, and be thoughtful about reusing across those platforms, but making sure that diversity of communications strategies is robust, is just as important as thinking about that for your fundraising.
I love a good syndication strategy for sure. Yeah. I think that's a
So
great, we're at 50 minutes, 51 minutes into the hour. So I think this is a good time to break and ask for questions in case anybody has them. And please, I think I see a lot
Yeah,
of
some good ones.
info in the Q&A. So I'm sure, Nicole, you want to
Yeah,
fire some of those at us?
I do. So I will start off with this one. So how can organizations, influencers, public figures, and other stakeholders proactively manage crises caused by misinformation spreading online, especially on social platforms and other platforms that use end-to-end encryption, which is a vast and also specific question. Um, any
This is
thoughts,
a big
anybody?
question.
It is.
Who
I
wants to
think
take?
I would maybe start with, again, thinking about who your influencers are, and I use influencers to think about, the people in your audience, who are your organization's friends, who can help spread whatever your message is um, to to reach others, right? Those other trusted sources, that are validating your organization's communications, but then have their own sort of suite of people that are trusted. So I would maybe lean into that, and I think that's a really specific question about encrypted conversations. I'm not as experienced with that, so I don't know if Tim or Bridget maybe have thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, the data privacy issue is huge, and it's crosses platforms, and I mean, it really is a major challenge. And unfortunately, we're not in a situation where we have really good, clear legislation. Last I checked, there were 14 or 15 states that had passed US-based legislation. We don't have an equivalent of the GDPR, which is in Europe, and so organizations can get away with a lot, unfortunately. And so I would encourage people to understand that and choose wisely if they can. I know that it's really hard for people to move away from things like X or Facebook or whatever, if that's where their primary audience is. We closed down our X and Facebook accounts a while ago, but we didn't actually delete the accounts because we didn't want someone taking them over and then impersonating us and stuff like that. So, but we've struggled with that too, because owning an account on a Meta platform, for instance, means they can still track you on all other websites all around the internet, and you know, they still have your data and stuff like that. So it's definitely a challenge. It's not an easy challenge, and I think ultimately it's going to come down to legislation. Unfortunately, I think, well, fortunately, personally for me, but I mean, I think, you know, these things need to be legislated. We're not going to see that anytime soon in the United States, at least. And so just making sure that we're making conscientious decisions around our use of them is really the best you could do at this point.
We are
Bridget, I don't know if you have anything more encouraging to say.
Yeah, I really don't, because we're still figuring it out.
Right.
We're still figuring it out. And I do think that it is, um, just being true to your brand values here as well.
Yeah.
And so that's what we're looking to figure out, because part of it is a security question and part of it is an ethics question of your brand and how you want to position yourself in the world, what it is that you actually stand for. So I think we're at an inflection point right now. And I will say honestly, like, I have a tough time, you know, wheeling away from some of these platforms, because in my mind, they're actually now utilities, just like electricity is, or riding the bus is for a lot of folks. And so that is the rub for me.
Right.
And that's what we're trying to figure out, because somewhere along the line, social media platforms became a utility,
Interesting.
and that changes the game.
I think we have time for maybe one more question. I know we have a couple of wrap-up slides we need to get through too. So go ahead, Nicole.
Yeah, so um I'll just do this one. We have a question that's wondering if we have any tips on tools or software, et cetera, or just general strategies for keeping a small team uh on track for short and long-term projects. Um,
Yeah,
Asana.
above and beyond Asana. I mean, we use
Yeah.
Asana.
Monday's
Asana.
cool.
What'd you
Notion's
say?
cool. Monday is a good platform.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
I
Notion
yeah.
depends.
I would also add, though, going back to the processes point that we talked about earlier, like there are so many great tools, and some groups just use an Excel spreadsheet, right? Like it has to be a tool that your team is
Works
going to
for,
use,
yeah.
and that might require a little bit of experimentation. The tool that works for us might not work for your team for all kinds of reasons. They might just not like how it looks, right? But that's important. And so, but making sure that you have the regular check-ins, like that are face to face or Zoom to Zoom, to talk about progress, and to step back and look at those longer term goals and overarching projects. To me, you can have the best tool in the world, but if you don't have that conversation and that communication, I feel like that's where things fall apart. So it's the tool and the team dynamic and the structure set up so that you are regularly checking in, on your projects. When I ran a team, we had regular check-ins. We were looking sort of like micro level. We had quarterly and we did annual, and they all three of those had very different goals for them.
All right, let's cut that there and move on.
All right.
We have a couple wrap-up slides here and some information on our upcoming webinars, and then we'll let you all move along.
All right. So, Bridget, could you tell us more about Access Living?
Yeah, just real briefly, we do both service and advocacy work, for people with disabilities, by people with disabilities in Chicago. Definitely check out our website, and thank you to our partner Mighty Bites for helping us to make it so accessible. My contact information is on the website, so you can contact me there, and I would love to hear from you to continue this conversation. It's really nice to meet everyone.
And where can you find Mighty Bites?
We are at mightybytes.com, and both Nicole and I are on LinkedIn. So maybe Nicole, will you share the links for those? And we cover many of the topics discussed today on our blog. We talk a lot about ethical and sustainable and more responsible and accessible communications, specifically as they relate to digital. And so feel free to check us out and subscribe to our newsletter. And Jen.
Yeah, you can find me at buoy231consulting.com and on LinkedIn. I also have a newsletter where once a week you can get tips and resources for so many of the different topics we talked about today. And to reiterate Bridget's point, I see there are so many great questions that we couldn't get to in the chat, but I'm certainly available, would love to hear from you. And I know we're all here as a resource to help you in some really, really challenging times.
For sure. On that note, let's since we have 1 minute left, we're going to talk about a couple of upcoming webinars. This is a 6-part series. So our next one, which takes place on March 11th, Kel Moody, who works with a leader in the B Corp movement and is also the principal of Alluvium Gatherings, is going to join us to discuss effective coalition building and community nurturing strategies for creating collective action. We can share a registration link to that. And then on April 1st, we're talking to Jennifer Sconiers from Abundance Leadership Consulting about how agility, innovation, and inclusion can inspire more cohesive and high-performing communications teams. We're going to do a community event, community collaboration, like an impact collaboration on April 17th, where we're hosting a group session to help communications professionals address their challenges outlined in this series. So we're going to have facilitated breakout rooms where you can, share ideas, share challenges that you're working on and get some direct answers. And then finally, we just added this one. It was pointed out to us that we hadn't been talking a lot about design as part of the communications toolkit. And so we added a session on design practices in an age of autocracy with Andrew Boardman from fellow B Corp agency Mangrove. And that will be on May 1st. So we hope that you will join us. Thank you so much for everybody for your time and for your questions. Sorry we couldn't get to all of them. But we really do appreciate it, and we look forward to connecting with you in the future.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So nice to be here. Have a great day.